Well, good evening. Michael, thank you for that introduction, and Daniel Green, thank you for welcoming us to your church and to the people next door. I just heard the most charming, I can't help falling in love with you as I went out to use the restroom, so it's a great spot to be tonight. I'm also so happy to see my cousin Michael McKinnon and his spouse Mary Beth here. Michael, thank you for coming, and Linda Sartor, who's been over to Afghanistan and played a very pivotal role in staying as long as she did with the Afghan Peace Volunteers. And Sherry back there is the person who has really kept us on schedule, and herself spent much of this past summer in Afghanistan, and is wearing the blue scarf that I'm supposed to make sure that we all are more aware of before we leave. So thank you. Leonard Cohen has a song, anthem. He says, "Ring the bell that still can ring, forget your perfect offering, there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." And then a refrain is, "Every heart to love will come, but like a refugee." Every heart to love will come, but like a refugee. And I sense I'm here with you tonight almost like a refugee. I didn't expect that the United States was going to go to war for a third time against Iraq. And I know for many it's kind of an unsettling, a jarring reality, and we're not sure how to catch up with the news that develops so fast. And so I find myself taking refuge in being able to be with groups like yours and people who have spent so much of their adult lives trying to work to build a better world. I also took refuge in the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech. And it was good for me to go back and reread that speech and try to think again about what it meant in his time, at the height of the Vietnam War, the civil rights leader, to be calling on people to basically love the Viet Cong. And if we update that, where are we? And King didn't just leave people hanging. He said at the end of his speech, I'm not talking about, he said sentimental bosh. I'm not sure what bosh is. But he said that what he meant was that we should try to see the humanity in the people that we consider our enemies, and try to see ourselves as we're seen by the so-called enemy. And as it happens, in the past few weeks, NBC took a poll, and they said that 94% of the people in the United States, this is one of the highest percentages ever, have all watched the same news footage of the beheadings. And quite honestly, I'm not somebody who, I haven't had a TV since I was 17. I remember thinking Farrah Fawcett was a plumbing company, for those of you who go back that far. I know nothing. But I certainly could tell you the names. And I speak with great regret and remorse for the family of Stephen Sotloff, for the family of James Foley, for the family of David Haynes, and he was actually a close friend, a very close friend of ours with the Nonviolent Peace Force. And certainly I think of Major Harold Green in Afghanistan, who was killed on a blue-on-green attack. Those names become familiar to us. And what I would like to share with you tonight are some of the stories of the people from Iraq. And I feel a bit sad because I can't tell you the names of almost any of the 500,000 children. First they died in the hundreds, and then the thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands, and then 500,000 children in Iraq were brutally punished to death under the regime of economic sanctions that the United States insisted on. But I could go back and retrieve some stories from that time, and I'd like to do that with you. But maybe I could start by talking about something that might have more immediate relevance. Some of you have probably heard that the person, I'm not sure how to refer to him as, he calls himself kind of the self-styled caliph of the caliphate. His name would be al-Baghdadi. And this man is at the head, if you will, of IS, Islamic State, or Islamic State in Levant, or Islamic State in Syria, ISIS. And al-Baghdadi is somebody who in 2005 was detained by the United States and was placed in a kind of an outdoor tent prison network of outdoor prison places called Qasr, in Qasr, and it was called Buka Camp. Now it happens that I visited the Buka Camp a year before he was detained, and I'd just like to talk with you a little bit about those experiences. Some young people, two guys, they were just out of their teenage years, had come to me and said, 5 of our friends are still in the Buka Camp. We were released, we think because we spoke English, and we can't go and try to find out how our friends are or even where our friends are, but we think you could. And I said, yeah, I could. And this was to me a very tall order. How was I ever to even find this place or get myself allowed to enter it? But I was with a Franciscan priest, Jerry Zawada, and a very strong activist, Claudia Lefko from Northampton. And it happened at that time that a group called the Christian Peacemaker Team still lived in Baghdad. And they had assigned themselves the very difficult but so necessary task of going to the various prisons where the United States was detaining Iraqis and asking Iraqis going in to visit their loved ones and coming out, would you want to give us the name of your loved one? And we're forming a database. It was kind of a computer, geek project in some ways. We're forming a database of all those names and as many capture tag numbers as we can get. And then they were setting up very good relationships, the best they could, respectful relationships with the U.S. military, so that they could get the information necessary to be able to track where people might be sent. It was a brilliant project. And it turned out that in their 6,000-person database, the Christian Peacemaker Team had the names of 2 of the 5 that my new young friends wanted us to visit. And I thought, well, that's a start. And then they also knew that when I would get to Qasr, which if in the geography of Iraq is south of Basra, and I always say, well, there's nothing south of Basra, then you're in Kuwait. But there is a port city in one of the most beleaguered, God-forsaken areas I've ever visited in the far south of Iraq. And the Christian Peacemaker Team members told me, when you get there, ask for Major Garrity. She's in charge. Well, who would have thought that in this kind of primitive prison tent encampment, they'd have visiting hours and visiting days? But they sure did. And visiting day was Tuesday or Saturday, and visiting hours ended at 2, and we turned up at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, maybe one of the biggest assets I bring to the peace movement is an extraordinary ability to look helpless. But we've come a long way, Andy. And so the person at the gate to this prison, I think, felt sorry for me. And I said, well, could you just go ask Major Garrity? And so he went and got Major Garrity, and she came, and she felt sorry for us too. And I think she also knew the 5 that we wanted to visit. And so she said, I'm going to break our own rules. Get in the back of that Jeep. And we were bumping across the desert sands, and there we were, with the brother of one of the prisoners. It was one of the most heartfelt embraces I've ever witnessed. And we spent time listening to the young men who were trapped in this prison. Now, I should also say that, as it happens, these young men were Palestinians. They had been students in Iraq, and their parents had said, get home, come back now, get out of that country. But one was a medical student, and the other was an engineering student, and they didn't have a medical school in the West Bank. They didn't have an engineering school in Gaza. And so they said to their parents, maybe the war will go very quickly. We don't want to lose our studies. We're going to take a risk and stay here. Oh, what a bad gamble. They lived in a dormitory that was the highest building on a street called Haifa Street. And the United States Marines wanted to be in the highest building on a street called Haifa Street so they could see what was going on. So they systematically went through the building, and they found these guys with foreign IDs and immediately wrote them down as third country nationals and threw them in prison. So this was a situation in which I had encountered the first 2. Now the first 2 told me very clear stories about what had happened to them. And my friends, these are not stories of torture. They're not stories of what would even qualify, I don't think, as serious human rights violations. So I just ask you to hear these young men in terms of humiliation and despair and resentment, deep resentment. And also I just have to ask you to trust me that when I went inside the camp with my two friends and the brother and the translator, the ones inside the camp told us the same stories. So I believe that what they were telling us was true. They told us that when they first arrived in the camp, they were at times paraded naked in front of US military women. And for a Muslim man, this is a source of great, grave shame. They said sometimes the guards would taunt them and make them hold up their bowls for food and bark like dogs. And dogs aren't considered pets, really, in Iraq or in Afghanistan, for that matter. Sometimes they had to say, "I love George Bush." When they first initially arrived, they had to sleep on the sand, and they were afraid of desert snakes and desert scorpions. And then when it got cold, they were very cold, and they were trying to dig holes in the sand so they could warm themselves up. There were a couple of 13-year-old kids that they were trying to protect because there were some real tough guys in that prison whom they knew would try to abuse these 13-year-olds, and they didn't have a way to call attention to that effectively. They said that they never were able to find out what they were charged with or how long they'd be there or how they could get word to their parents. And so until we came, they hadn't heard from anyone, and they were feeling angry and desperate and really, in a way, ripe for retaliation or revenge. Now, I tell you all that because al-Baghdadi, when he was imprisoned, and by that time I think the prison was actually improved a bit. They'd started to create actual buildings. But these kinds of prison situations are not pleasant. He was there for 4 years. And the New York Times says that he did recruitment to bring people into whatever you want to call it, the Caliphate or IS or ISIL. He recruited from that camp south of Basra in a place called Qasr. So there were worse places. I would encourage any of you that are further interested in this to go to the New York Review of Books. I think it's November 30th of 2003 to read about Forward Operating Base Mercury. And there really were human rights violations and what you might call torture happening, and it's described in great detail. But just like they would take a prisoner under control, they called those people a puck. And any soldier who wanted to blow off steam could just go and beat the daylights out of one of these prisoners. And if an arm or a leg was broken, you could just get the doctor to come over and sign for it. And this is written up in the New York Review of Books. It's not a left-wing radical paper. The prisoners were sometimes subjected to standing for long, like stress test positions, and they'd have to hold big gallons of water, and pretty soon their bodies would start to shake, and then, it's in the hot sun, they'd collapse, and then you could kick sand on them and laugh at them and taunt them, and this is all written up. And so what I just want us to remember is that in Iraq, since 1980, when Henry Kissinger said things couldn't be better, they're killing each other and using our weapons over the course of the Iran-Iraq war. And then in 1991, when the United States bombed Iraq after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, which was a wrongful thing to do, the United States bombed Iraq and every single electrical facility was wiped out. So let me tell you a brief story from a time when I was there with a group called the Gulf Peace Team. And I think I could say that at that point, maybe the most courageous thing I did was get on the Archer Avenue bus and go out to 56th and Normandy and tell my mother what I was about to do. It was a non-starter. I had just done 9 months in maximum security prison for planting corn on nuclear missile silo sites, and my mom thought that was quite enough for that year, right? And so then I'm home saying, well, guess what? I'm going to go over to Iraq. And I tried explaining to my family, well, if we were concerned about one country invading another, the United States just invaded Grenada and Panama. And that wasn't working. And I said, if we're concerned about, supporting an evil dictator, well, we supported dictators in Central and South America all through the 70s. But I realized I was getting nowhere, and it was just time to cut my losses. And so, when you sometimes give a wooden hug to somebody, I shared a kind of wooden hug with my mother and said goodbye. And as I walked out the door, I got a blast of Chicago January cold air in my face, and my mother's Irish accent said, "What about the incubators? Kathy, what about the incubators?" Well, she kind of had me, because when Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, August 6th, 1990, shortly after that time, a very beautiful Kuwaiti teenager testified in front of a Senate investigating committee, her name was Nayira, that she had witnessed Iraqi soldiers burst into a Kuwaiti hospital, ripped the incubators out of the wall, dumped the infants out to die, and went off and looted the incubators. And Nayira's testimony was picked up on C-SPAN, and my mother saw it, and people all across the country were reminded of it because George Bush Sr. referred to this in his State of the Union speech. And so hands kind of started to go up in the Congress and all across the country, I think echoing my mother, you've got to do something about people like that. They've got to be stopped. Well, as I say, the bombing in 1991 wiped out every electrical facility across Iraq. Incubators weren't useful because you didn't have any electricity. The water purification system was dependent on electricity, and so pretty soon people were beginning to become very sick with waterborne diseases, and there were all kinds of problems because with the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever imposed in modern history, people couldn't get the most simple medicines. They couldn't get the most simple things that were needed. And so in about, I think, the summer of 1991, two very enterprising reporters, one from the New York Times, the other from TV Guide, what can I say? They went to Kuwait to talk to these doctors and to find out about that terrible day when the Iraqi soldiers burst in and stole the incubators. And the Kuwaiti doctors were kind of puzzled and were saying, what do you want with incubators? You want buy, you want sell? We have many in store. And the New York Times guy figured something's not right with this story, and he started to dig a bit, and it turned out that Nayira, the Kuwaiti teenager, had never left the United States. She'd never come back into the United States. In fact, there were records of her being at her Washington, D.C. school during those days when she said she was witnessing what happened in the hospital, and she was the daughter of an employee at the Kuwaiti embassy in Washington, D.C., and the New York Times said the whole story was a hoax. That the Kuwaiti embassy had hired the Hill and Knowlton public relations firm to coach them in how to more or less market or sell Rahim. And he's telling me that he now tells the women who have infants who should be in incubators that if they wrap the infant in gauze or maybe cellophane and then put the infant between their breasts and wrap themselves in a blanket and then put their abaya around them, they might simulate the conditions of an incubator because they don't have any incubators in the hospitals in Iraq anymore. And all of a sudden there was a commotion, and people were calling for Dr. Qasai Rahim. There's no intercom, they just scream, and he heard his name screamed, and he ran, and so I kind of ran after him. And he went to the bedside of a tiny child, Ferial, and her mother sat cross-legged on the bed next to her, and Ferial had had the grave misfortune of having had starvation plus a respiratory infection. And her little heart was trying to fight off the consequences of starvation and the respiratory infection, and she suffered a cardiac arrest. And Dr. Qasai Rahim bent over her and he gave her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And I saw the gleaming look of hope on the mother's face, and Ferial was breathing again. And then we saw Dr. Qasai Rahim's face, and he straightened up, and he said, I am sorry. This child she cannot live. You see, we have some oxygen, but we have not the tube. There was an oxygen tank, and the tube they had was the size of a pencil. And Feriel's tiny nostril was the size of the point of a pencil. And so the tube was too large. And for want of a piece of plastic, the little baby breathed her last. And my shoulder was damp from the mother's tears. She had clung to me, and she said to me, "Believe me, I pray, that this never happened to a woman, she is from your country. That this never happened to a mother from your country." And so I could also tell you that my friend Martin Thomas, a nurse from England, once in a very all too similar situation in a hospital ward, looked around and he said, "I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it? A death row for infants. 500,000 children, they should have been teenagers by now." And Carol Bellamy, the head of UNICEF, called a press conference in 1999, and she went to the National Press Club, and she wanted to explain to the media why and how the United Nations could say that these economic sanctions had directly contributed to the deaths of over 500,000 children under age 5 in Iraq. And we thought, wow, this is really going to spread ripples and, rock the rafters. The next day, 1/2 of one sentence in the Wall Street Journal covered that press conference. And about a week later, there were 2 sentences in the New York Times. And so you see, when the United States media and government want us to know about a situation, as 94% of the population now knows about the terrible beheadings, and when this can help to market a war, as Naira helped to market a war, then we know. But I can tell you story after story after story that we'll never hear, that we don't know, that we need to know, because these are the stories that would help us understand why people in other lands might look to us and see us as fearful, as menacing people. Of course we're not fearful or menacing people. But as our policies are played out and our wars are continued, I'm not somebody with any medical skills, and Linda and I know a wonderful doctor. Maybe some of you know her, Dr. April Hurley, and she has very good medical skills. And April came to be with us during the bombing in shock and awe. And in the beginning, Saddam Hussein's government was still in power. And you couldn't, if you were over there, just get in a taxi cab and go someplace. It was a police state, believe me. But if you were me, you could, because I'd been there so many times, back and forth, back and forth. And so if April was going to go to the hospital, April is the medical doctor, she pretty much had to have me with her. And I, in a way, didn't want any longer to go to the hospitals and see more children whose bodies were torn apart. I'd written, I'd taken pictures, and I thought, I have nothing to offer. And I didn't want to be like a voyeur. But April said, "You're going to go, aren't you?" And so I got into the hospital with her, and there was just chaos. And April went right to work. And I tried to get out of the way, and I sat on a bench near the emergency room. And then all of a sudden, I realized a woman was sitting next to me, and she was sobbing heavily. And I put my arm around her. She said, "How I tell him? What I say?" And you see, she was the aunt of a 12-year-old child who was in surgery. And the aunt and the child's mother and father, her sisters and brothers, they had all been having lunch on a patio. And somehow they were mistaken, I suppose, as people that were enemies, and a missile flew into their home. And, well, Ali Abbas was losing his arms cut off before at the shoulder. And she had to figure out how she would tell him that not only had he lost both arms, but she was now his only surviving relative. And the surgeons came out and they said, we told him. And they told us that Ali's response was to ask them, will I always be this way? And when I heard that, I don't know, it somehow, in the deep heart's core, went into my mind, will we always be this way? And I was down. I was out for the count. It was because of community and grandmothers and children and other people who shared this hotel with me, and because of a novel, to tell you the truth, I think I was able to come back to life. But 4 years later, I heard Ali Abbas's voice. He was being interviewed by a BBC reporter, and the BBC reporter was reporting that he had learned how to feed himself with a spoon inserted between his toes, and he'd actually become a very accomplished painter with a paintbrush inserted between his toes. And then he said to her in perfect English, he learned English, when she asked him, what would you like to be when you grow up, Ali? He said, I'm not sure, but I want to work for peace. And so, I was a high school teacher for many years. I never thought that at age 61, my mentors would consistently be groups of teenagers. But Ali Abbas gave me my marching orders. How about you? And the Afghan peace volunteers, whom I'd also like to tell you about tonight, are also among my main mentors in life. So I guess what I most want to say with regard to the marketing of war is that I know I need to almost have a vaccination or an inoculation. I need to steel myself in a sense, and I think we're all that way, so that we won't be swept up with thinking, oh, there's no other alternative. These people are so outrageous, we must therefore do something terribly outrageous and go to war. Because who benefits? The people that make and market and sell and store and use the weapons benefit. But I see no further other benefits. In fact, I think it jeopardizes our security, and our security really would rest in extending the hand of friendship to other people all around the world, which we could do if we weren't pouring our resources into the Pentagon, which will just take and take and take. And in general, when I think about impoverishment in the world and what would help to solve the problems of poverty, I think, oh, there has to be literacy for girls and women. Teach a girl how to read and write, and she'll be able to help the family. When she has a baby, she'll make sure she has an assistant or a midwife when she's raising her child. If she's literate herself, she'll send her child to school. She won't let the girl child be sold off to a terrible marriage. Literacy. And then I sort of had an epiphany, I think, about a week ago. I thought, oh no, the literacy we need is among the women and others in this country. We have to become literate about the stories about the people who can't escape from our bombs. We have to become literate, just like how hard it is to learn a language. Every day we have to study it, we have to know it, we have to talk about it, we have to promote it. This literacy about the consequences of our war. Because so often people don't know, and they can be sold down the river by the marketers who want wars to continue. So it's a real gift for me to be able to tell you a little bit about mothers I've met in Afghanistan, although their stories are quite sad. 3 women had come, and they said to me in various versions, I think I'm losing my mind. I feel I'm going insane. I'm becoming emotionally disturbed. What's wrong, Fatima? Why are you saying that, Sakina? Shakira, what's happened? And in each case, I cannot feed my children. And then you have to ask, well, what do you have in the home? And the answer, stale bread and tea without sugar. 500,000 children in Afghanistan today are suffering from severe acute malnourishment. Their mothers can't feed them, and you never overcome severe acute malnourishment, stunted growth, brain deficiencies. Now the good news would be that the cost to get the iodized salt into the diet of a child who is likely to have brain deficiency without that iodized salt, if they're suffering from severe acute malnourishment, would be 5 cents per child per year. The cost to keep one U.S. soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year is $2.1 million. I have these wonderful friends who have a hospital called the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War. And they run 3 hospitals in Afghanistan and 43 clinics and ambulances that go all along the roads. And they really are well loved and respected in Afghanistan. And they in fact tell us that now the Taliban are controlling 70% of the country. But Felipe, who has a very good sense of humor, was a nurse, said to me at one point, "Allora, Cathy, just you send 3 of your soldiers, they go home, bye-bye. Yeah, you send them home early. You give me $2.1 million each of these 3. I have $6.3 million. What I do? I build another hospital, yeah." The Italians, the Europeans, the people that we meet in Afghanistan so often recognize the utter folly of how United States resources are being spent in Afghanistan, but we don't necessarily see it. We think we're protecting the women and children. How often I've heard people say, well, I really can't imagine if the United States troops were to leave Afghanistan and abandon the women and children. Well, first of all, if I could tell you that the widows get pushed up the mountainside. My young Afghan peace volunteer friends once took me up the mountain with them so that they could go in and see which women were the neediest and to whom they might deliver one of the duvets, this heavy blanket that they distribute to the neediest of people free of charge, while other women can get a living wage making them. And going up that mountainside, I started to realize that this is a very harsh existence that the women are subjected to who don't have breadwinners in the home. There's no road, and there's just this kind of icy, jagged terrain, and they have to go all the way down to the bottom to get water and then carry it all the way back up, and they don't have a breadwinner or an income, and all of a sudden I started to faint, and the kids were kind of holding on to the back of my coat so I wouldn't fall back down the mountain, and they had to put me somewhere, so we just went into the home of a woman who didn't know me from Adam's house cat, Horeb, and she never stopped shelling almonds while they're giving me tea and reviving me, because she put the almond shells inside her small stove, and that was her only source of fuel. And then her son would take the almond meats and go down to the market and try to sell them, and that was their only source of income. And I asked her, Horeb, what do you think is the most important thing so that people can move forward in your country? And she said, teach the girls. Make the girls literate. So I realized that that's the path. But at this juncture, 1 out of every 11 women in Afghanistan dies in childbirth. The rate of unemployment is, some say, as high as 62 to 70%. Afghanistan is the most corrupt country in the world. 92% of the world's opium is coming from Afghanistan. It's the largest exporter of marijuana in the world. The children can't eat opium, they can't eat marijuana, right? So something has not gone right. Now, meanwhile, we think we're protecting the women and children from the Taliban. But ever since the surge, when 30,000 troops surged into Afghanistan, and before then, all of the food, the fuel, the ammunition, the supplies that's been delivered to United States bases and forward operating bases, all has been truck delivered. You can't fly it, and the plane would crash because of the weight. The trucks go to the ports of Karachi and Gwadar and Pakistan, and the ships offload the supplies for the United States troops, right? Lots of supplies, lots of trucks, lots of drivers. Now, it isn't like they have easy pass going along the roads. What happens is that along every stretch of road, every truck and every convoy has to pay a bribe, first to the Pakistani Taliban and other warlords who control those roads. Then they cross at the Khyber Pass or Quetta, and they pay more bribes to the Afghan Taliban or drug lords or warlords, so that over all these years, Anatol Levin says in the New York Review of Books, the United States has been subsidizing the Taliban over all of these years of war. And we think we're protecting the women and children. Meanwhile, the drones are flying overhead 24/7 doing surveillance. You'd think they might notice some of these convoys of opium going out of the country, but we don't hear too much about that. And sometimes the drones are weaponized. They have underneath the drone a 500-pound bomb or Hellfire missiles. And sometimes they coordinate with the combat brigade unit helicopters. And so there was one time when 9 children were out on a mountainside doing what my young friends do so routinely. They go out 6 hours to get to the side of the mountain where with a pickaxe they can wrestle out tumbleweed and twigs so they'll have fuel. And these children were laboring on the mountainside. And all of a sudden, 2 of these huge combat brigade unit helicopters, the engine inside this helicopter is the same as the engine inside of an Abrams tank. They are the largest airborne vehicle in the U.S. arsenal, and they flew up the side of the mountain, and there was a green flash, a gun protruded out, and they began to shoot the children as they were working on the mountainside. But one of the first barrages of bullets cracked a tree in half, and the leafy branches fell down on Wahidullah. And Wahidullah survived. And he told his story. The parents had heard the explosions on the mountainside. No doubt they were hoping against hope that it wasn't what they thought it must be. They went and they found their children dismembered and bloodied. And General Petraeus was in charge of the International Security Assistance Forces at the time. And with the eyewitness Wahidullah, 13 years of age, traumatized but telling what he'd seen, General Petraeus said, "This tragic event should never have happened." But I'm sorry to say, tragic events so similar to that, women clearing out irrigation ditches, farmers in their fields, children with their flocks, happened again and again and again. And so, yes, there was resentment and desire for revenge or despair on the part of many people when they view Westerners like myself. And it's very hard for us to understand this because this isn't something that the United States will want to present to us. And do you know there are 70,000 analysts who are poring over the footage collected by the drones day after day so they can establish patterns of life in Afghanistan. And I think, you want to establish patterns of life in Afghanistan? Come with Sherry, come with me, live with the Afghan Peace Volunteers, go up the mountain, meet Koran, go into the schools and see how hard it is on these kids. Recently, people in Gaza, one of the world's largest outdoor prisons in a sense, endured 50 days of airborne bombing. And I had been in Gaza in 2009 during what was called Operation Cast Lead, toward the end of that bombing. And a bomb exploded once every 11 minutes, from 11 at night till 1 in the morning. And then you could time it. There would be a break, and at 3 o'clock it would start again, once every 11 minutes. I know nothing normally about ballistics. But even I began to know, oh, that was a Hellfire missile fired from an Apache helicopter. That was a 500-pound bomb dropped by an F-16. And the reason I began to know was because the children taught it to me. And when we got word there would be a ceasefire, Yusuf, the mother in the house where I stayed, sank into a chair, the back of her palm hit her forehead, and she said, "Can you imagine? This first time I breathe in all these days, I am so afraid for my children." The first time she breathes. And in the emergency room, Dr. Abdul Hussein happened to grow up one neighborhood away from me in Chicago. And I asked him, what should I tell people when I go back home? And he said, well, tell them that these white phosphorus weapons are terrible. They start to burn as soon as they're exposed to oxygen. We can't even do surgeries because when we try to pull out the white phosphorus, we're inhaling it. And tell them that the dense inert metal explosion bombs are like nothing I've ever seen. They cut limbs in half. And then he said, no. I am completely wrong. Just you go back and say United States money paid for these weapons. I said, I'll try. And so, how shall we see ourselves as we're seen by other people? This is the literacy in a sense that it's our task to build and develop, and it takes a lot of discipline. And it takes the kind of courage that you catch from one another. And it takes finding joy in our actions as well. So I'll close by encouraging you to please be in touch with Campaign Nonviolence. Sherry can tell you more about that afterward. And of course be in touch with the Harvest of Peace. And Voices tends to do long ordeal-oriented projects. That's one of our, we do 30-day fasts, 40-day fasts, walk from Chicago to Minneapolis, and my feet stopped hurting in November that year. But we walked from Rock Island to Des Moines, Iowa on the issue of drones. And drones were being operated out of a base in Des Moines, and they're being operated out of bases all over, including Beale Air Force Base here. But that particular summer, we walked through the cornfields, which are really kind of monotonous, to tell you the truth. And so to keep ourselves awake and alert, Linda Sartor did this walk with us. I walked alongside Luke Nephew, and we made up verses. He's a hip-hop poet, and I was kind of proud that he was even saying some of my verses into his cell phone so he could remember them. And so I'd just like to offer this one. I spy, what do you spy? Drone overhead with a camera eye. I spy, okay, tell me, drone's got a weapon in its belly. I spy, I might die. I am a victim of a lie. I am 16, I might die. I am a victim of a lie. I am 17, I might die. I am a victim of a lie. To tell the truth, every heart to love will come, but like a refugee, and together we can rely on Truth Force and believe that we are all part of one another, and war is never the answer. Thank you for your time.